I instead am a professor of bioengineering at MIT, and I work in both synthetic biology and AI for drug discovery. So let's go through each of the panelists in turn. I'll just introduce, if you could just say a couple sentences. So let's start with my colleague and collaborator from MIT, Regina Barzilay. Regina, you're muted.
Yeah, I unmuted myself. So great to see you, Jim, even remotely. It is indeed a dear collaborator. So I'm a professor of electrical engineering and computer science at MIT, and I work on machine learning for drug discovery. I work both on small molecules and biologics, and I was fortunate enough to collaborate with many researchers across pharmaceuticals and biotechs. So in the last 5 years, I learned something about pharma. So excited to be here.
Welcome, Regina. And we have Ariel Katz from H1.
Hey, everyone. My name is Ariel. I'm the CEO of H1. H1, our mission is to connect the world to the right doctor. We profile every doctor around the world and tell you everything you want to know about them. I've been running this company for the past 5 years. Excited to be here.
Well, thanks, Ariel. And we have Eric Horvitz from Microsoft.
Eric Horvitz, I'm Microsoft's Chief Scientific Officer, working in strategy as well as technology. Topics include AI, biosciences, and beyond.
And last but not least, we have Lieven from McKinsey.
Thanks, Jim. Wonderful to meet everybody. Lieven Veken. I come from the other end. I have been working in pharma, biotech, CDMO, CROs for the last 20 years. And of course, the advent of these major disruptive events cause main questions. So the question that I work on all the time is, how do you actually get these things to impact? How do you actually make a difference in what pharma companies do, what biotech does, with all these new technologies?
Well, thanks. So we're going to start with some questions, and we can actually open it up to the audience in a little bit. But I'd like to just start, maybe we get comments from each on what do you view as the current state of play of AI being integrated into both biopharma and more broadly biotech? Maybe I'll start with Eric.
That's a very, very big question,
yeah.
And we probably could spend just the whole session on that topic. We have what I would call classical machine learning, supervised machine learning, the kind of learning that Regina and I grew up on, and that the opportunities there are barely scratching the surface of application, all at the same time as the explosion of generative AI methods, which are now framing a whole new set of directions. When I give talks or meet with folks on state of play, the first thing I say is, let's not overlook graph neural networks. The recent advances in supervised machine learning, as we get into this, what's called self-supervised machine learning, and then now this explosion of interest and, I would say, surprising emergent capabilities we're seeing with these large, we call them foundation models, and all that we can do with them. Let me just focus for a second on the latter. These models are showing, and it's still very early days, the field is moving very quickly. I expect in 5 years, it'll be a whole different story given the speed and the acceleration we're seeing in this space. But they're showing capabilities that apply deeply to biochemical processes, to protein design, to thinking out of the box about the core science, as well as with a twist and a different perspective, impressive work in the clinical sciences, in thinking through clinical trials, in understanding patients and their needs, in explaining things to patients, in reducing the burden, the administrative burden that many clinicians face, giving them more time for patients and for research. So we can go on and on about this, but I wanted to just say this. We can't look at AI as one thing. It's a constellation of fabulous tools and methods. Many of us have spent most of our last few decades in the earlier version of what we call machine learning. That's a really set of promising tools for doing prediction, for doing diagnosis, for doing design. And now some of us are being distracted in a good way, but also we're learning a lot about the new methods coming to the fore.
Thanks, that was marvelous. Lieven.
I think one can take a real glass half full and glass half empty view to where we are, right? If you want to have the glass half full frame, it is very clear that the technology, the use cases, the point solutions are incredibly powerful, and many of them have already been proven to achieve their goals, right? What are you trying to achieve with that intervention, right? Especially when you think about research and especially when you think about clinical services, right? And there's many, many, many examples and we talk about them often. The glass half empty view is if you then look at what it has done to our productivity as an industry, right? To actually the products that have gotten to patients, right? We're at the very beginning of the journey. And if you want to be a bit critical, you could even say, where is the impact, right? How have clinical development times changed? Where actually is the increase in probability of success? Where is sort of the breakthrough that has been proven? So if you take those two frames, you can then also conclude we are at a bit of a watershed moment, because this is the time that actually products that have been generated by AI-first biotech companies are starting to move from phase 1 to phase 2, right? This is the time that we're starting to see the funding flow actually decrease, not increase, right? This is the time that we see the number of collaborations between pharma companies and AI-first biotechs start to go down. Right? So people are really watching this and say, okay, what's going to happen? Which means that it has major implications for where we should focus as an industry right now, is proving that impact and proving that it actually is the glass half full view we should keep adhering to and not start pivoting to a glass half empty view.
Yeah, thanks. Regina, what is the status of your AI glass?
So I, of course, agree with both speakers, but I want to suggest like two kind of areas. I'm thinking about it as a machine learning person. And as a machine learning person, what we see right now is first, one of the bigger challenges of integrating this technology is the fact that not only we many times lack the data, but we cannot really test what we are producing. So Eric was previously talking about generative AI in chemistry. We have been working on this area since 2019. And I actually stopped working on generative AI for small molecules and do it on proteins. And the reason is that it's much easier for us to generate proteins, to find, the labs that can generate proteins, than to do empirical validations of molecules. So today you have the whole body of literature in machine learning that, publishes results, or Gen AI produces molecule with some synthetic evaluation, which were never really evaluated in practice. So we don't really know how these methods work. And whenever we see a publication that say, oh, generative AI came up with molecules, we don't really know how much of it was generative AI and how much of it was a chemist, a medicinal chemist that actually selected the right candidate out of the set produced. So we don't really know how some of these technologies, not all, some other technologies for retrosynthesis, for property predictions have been validated, broadly used. But especially for Gen AI, we have this big issue that computer science, machine learning, and people who are actually generating the data, who are producing drugs, are right now sort of two disconnected communities. And we also see that, again, if you look at what kind of questions people in machine learning are asking, it's a very limited set of questions. Like we can, do docking and binding and some generation, but there are so many other questions that needs to be answered and require new technology, because the first generation of tools that we currently have relies on the technology that, Eric was mentioning, foundational model that primarily came out of natural language processing. And, in some, you apply them to protein, they produce amazing result. But Eric, I don't know if you've seen a paper from Microsoft, actually, I think from Cambridge, that shows that this model really didn't deliver when they were applied to the cells, when people applied them to cell atlases. So it's not like you can just take this technology.
With work for Microsoft.
Yeah. So very interesting negative results. Similarly, we don't have any foundational work for small molecule. So what I'm trying to say, whatever we can bring, we shall bring and adapt. But there are lots of new challenging questions that we still don't have technology for. And I think that's what we need kind of to move it forward and to make it really broadly used in the pharmaceutical industry.
Thanks, Regina. Ariel.
Yeah, that was great. So I think my colleagues come from the expertise and lens of drug discovery, targeting, protein, et cetera. The lens that we work with life sciences companies, pharma, biotech, med device, is running clinical trials and then educating patients and doctors about those clinical trials. And so I was in a room in San Diego about 3 weeks ago, 1,500 people in pharma. I said, how many people have had a meeting in the past year to talk about how AI could change their workflow? Literally everyone raised their hand. And I asked, how many people are doing it? And there was like 2 people that raised their hand. It was a very, very small percentage. This is in particular to generative AI. Very basic use cases. Teams that publish peer-reviewed publications about their therapy. How many of you use generative AI to translate that into Japanese? Or do you still have a human being do that? How many people ask to translate that into a way that a 12-year-old can understand because they're taking their drugs? Answer was nobody. They still have human beings doing stuff that technology can do today. Then we asked the question, how many people have used generative AI to help identify an investigator to work on the clinical trial that you have going on now, or write a protocol? And then no one raised their hand. And so I do think that there have been huge technology breakthroughs that are not currently implemented that will save hundreds of hours, change workflow completely for how clinical trials are run, which should impact speed of a clinical trial, reduce costs associated with it, and also education of the world about these clinical studies. And the technology is not currently implemented, and they don't fully understand where to implement it yet. And so that's what I've seen. I do think that's going to change over the next few years, but I think everyone's still trying to figure it out. And compliance teams are asking, are you stealing my data? And they don't understand it. It's like probably a cloud. It's like, where's it go? What's the cloud? And I think that's where the market is now. They're still trying to wrap their head around it. IT teams don't understand it. Compliance teams are fully not there yet.
Regina.
I'm really sorry that I'm stealing somebody's turn, but I just want to say, just for fairness' sake, that there are companies, I'm on the board of some of these companies, like for instance, Johnson, that really demonstrated amazing utilization of AI technology for optimizing clinical trials, for doing, document generation things. So I'm sure that in that particular audience that you presented, they were, may not be familiar. And I think that what we're observing now, that landscape is not uniform. So in some companies where the data science team is really on top of what's going on, we see very broad application of the technology, a lot of novel cases. While, in some other companies, we are not quite there. So I think that potential is for everywhere, but we already see a lot of really amazing examples of implementation. Some of the cases that you mentioned are already been implemented. I just want to give a fair picture.
Jump in, let me just echo what Gina said. So there are obvious, powerful use cases with today's technology, even with its rough edges, that are just like, I can't say anything else than mind-blowing, putting myself in my shoes like 3.5 years ago. Economic pressures and diffusion of innovation will create a cascade and a wave. So I have no question in my mind that people who aren't doing these things, where they're clearly applicable, will be doing them like 100%, and those methods per the use cases and the iteration going on will get more efficient and better over time. So I have, laissez-faire economics will win there, because we know certain things about these systems in terms of their capabilities, especially with natural language, properly constrained with proper kinds of prompting and so on. The shocking thing to me in talking to folks across not just healthcare, but many areas, in a quiet corner of a room, someone will say, well, Eric, we started with ChatGPT with 3.5, that was the model that came out in November. We have a bunch of stuff going in our back room, our back office. It's all dependent on that now. Banking companies, people aren't talking a lot about that, and they're not sharing yet what they're doing with these technologies, but that will become more known, and there will be rising norms and standards of practice, and groups like McKinsey will be saying, do it this way, and so on.
I think thank you for that. That's indeed what we're trying to do. It is actually very hard, though, because there's 2 problems you have to solve, in addition to, of course, the technology problem, right? Trying to find the right use case, the right technology for the right answer. That's part 1, right? The second thing you then have to do is you then have to make sure that everybody that's part of a function or a domain gets to full adoption of these technologies. And it's a massive change management challenge, massive training challenge. It's really important. But then the third level is, if you truly want to get to the impact, you actually have to rewire your processes and your companies, right? Some people have used the analogy of the steam engine, right? When the steam engine steam actually sort of was replaced by electricity, you could actually, if you have a steam engine, you have a shaft that goes up and down. And all of your rooms, all of your manufacturing activities are actually linked to that, right? If you have electricity, you can actually optimize for a sequential or whatever way you want to do it, right? That is fundamental. That's why it took 20 or 30 years, because you have to change the layout of your plants. You have to retrain all your people. You can actually start using different machinery. It's the same challenge here, right? You have to redesign who is actually doing what do you do when. Think about what you know about a patient, right? When do we really talk about what patients look like? We think about patients when we try to think about what is the right indication. We think about patients, what's the right sort of target population for a clinical trial. But actually, if you truly deeply understand patient population in the real world, that should fuel everything across R&D, right? You're taking something which is a step in the process and making it a foundational capability. That's not easy. And it will require different processes, different functions, different names, different jobs, right? So it's a very fundamental reinvention of R&D that's needed to get to the full impact.
So what do we need to fill the other half of the glass? So how are we going to really fully realize AI specifically in personal and public health, writ large, whether it's biotech, pharma, or clinical trials?
I sort of agree with Eric on this. European Society of Medical Oncology took place over the past few weeks. With the companies we work with, how many of them said, we're going to ask ChatGPT or other technologies, tell me all the insights that occurred at ESMO and how my company should think about strategy now, across different functions. R&D, medical, clinical, commercial, you name it. The rewiring of workflow is going to take time, but I think once people start to use the technology and some of the pressures, laissez-faire pressures are going to occur, you're going to see natural adoption take place, and the technology is going to enable those processes, to force those processes to change, either bottoms up, we're seeing teams do it, like business functions do it, before it's done centrally. And so I do believe as the technology gets better, as it is more trustworthy, as people understand it more and become more educated, particularly around generative AI, you will see a natural adoption of those technologies, which will force rewiring of those processes as well. So I would bet on the technology forcing the future.
Yeah, so first of all, let me just say that everybody knows this, but the technology is moving. We're not standing on firm ground right now. The use cases that are being developed and tested and the rough edges that come to the fore are being heard loud and clear by the AI researchers, and we're really interested in addressing those, especially as highlighted in the context of actual scenarios. When our team got access to GPT-4 in August of last year, we were the initial team at Microsoft doing safety work on it, but we were just blown away by the capabilities. We reached out under NDA to clinicians across the country. We had a number of scenarios to biopharma people. One interesting set of experiences were my engagement with Trevor Mundell, who's Director of Global Health for Gates Foundation. And we just sat together for hours working through scenarios in Africa on the ground. How could the system translate between Swahili and Zulu back to English again? How could it help a non-expert healthcare professional on the ground dealing with an HIV patient with a fever coming into the clinic? And we were just remarkable. In the context of real-world kind of like cases we created to explore, amazed at possibilities. So there's scenarios like that right on the ground. Back to like healthcare more generally, let's go back to the Western and developing nations. There's debate about this. I'm quite convinced that these systems have a really rich theory of mind capability, theory of mind in clinical care. They understand, you can ask these systems, and we've done some studies and confirmation, what are the patient's questions at this moment hearing this diagnosis? And the system will just generate and frame from the patient's point of view kind of the information needs. You say, well, can you draft answers to these 3 questions for the patient for a flyer and put it into Spanish? And then back to English again so I can check it. These kinds of bridges to patient care and patient understanding will be a very big deal. Right, and describe now the situation to the patient's granddaughter who's concerned. We have cases like this online. If you look up AI anthology, we put up a set of cases that we ran back in the fall of last year, just demonstrating the remarkable power in healthcare, in education, and in the sciences to get a sense for what can be done. Sometimes it takes exploration in the absence of standards of practice and hearing about all the great uses right now that are out there. People are just amazed when they try something they think the system couldn't do, and then work to validate it with an actual empirical study. So I think that this is going to be a very big deal for healthcare, especially with relationships and understandings that patients have of complex medical conditions.
I think getting this to real, making the glass half full will depend on whether we're going to be able to scale the impact of these technologies or not, right? And how fast we'll be able to do that. Because doing that well requires an incredible amount of management attention and investment. It's a real commitment, right? And the question for us, I think, collectively is going to be, how do you move from that being a point solution, right? Do something which we do today, but much better, much faster, much cheaper, right? But still it being one of 50 critical steps in an R&D process, to taking a domain and then truly deeply transforming it. One of my favorite examples is actually closed-loop research systems, right? If you think about designing a gene-based therapy, you have a lot of questions, right? Question number one is, what's actually the right target, right? Question number two is actually, what is the right sequence you're going to be designing? There's a lot of great algorithms about what is 5', 3' capping. All of these things exist, right? Then you have a question, what's your carrier going to be? And then you actually want to think about how would that play out in the real world? Each of these problems have a lot of AI-based application that one can deploy, right? But to get to a real impact, what if you had a scientist who could sit behind a desk and actually work through these different steps in a coherent manner, right? In a suite that allows them to do it, but link it up with their lab experiments, right? So they can actually bring in and solve the problem Regina was talking about earlier, like bring in the real data, right? And do the experiment and make the learning happen. But to design such a closed-loop research system, if you do that well, then you could potentially say, hey, we're actually going to really displace all of these different steps, which are different teams, different people, different partners for a pharma company, by an integrated suite. And I think that notion of taking these different technologies and closing the gap between the technology and what actually is a scientist doing with it and what are all the steps they need to do is of great potential, because then you can start saying, hey, we're going to scale the impact because we're going to fundamentally displace our current activities A through Z or A through F by this AI-enabled suite of services.
And we have companies now that in pharma, like I'm thinking of my neighbor and close friend Daphne Kohler's company in Citro.
Yep, exactly.
They just said, let's think this through the whole pipeline from the ground up with the tools we have available now, including generative AI now. How do we do the imaging? How do we do the tracking of the expression data? How do we cycle quickly? And so I think that we're thinking through the wireframe of the modern drug discovery and drug targeting programs. And then this is in the context of another incredible frontier advance, which is in protein design. I spent my day yesterday in Seattle at the Institute for Protein Design with David Baker and Linda Stewart. These are very close colleagues of ours in terms of the work we've been working on together over the years, including the compute support for example, Rosetta Fold 2. But just to sit in a room there and to see all the drugs that have been designed from the ground up, de novo, including new kinds of cancer therapies, binders for beta amyloid, a vaccine that's completely synthetic antigen for COVID-19 that's now being distributed in Korea, binders that will shut down COVID-19, that was designed to just block that trimer. We're going to be seeing, especially recently, with a whole new approach called diffusion modeling, which was explored originally and popularized with your favorite apps, Stable Diffusion, and Midjourney, and DALL-E 2, to proteins. And it's just amazing the advance in the ability to design protein that have certain shapes, and now we're getting into function prediction. That's going to, I think, be completely game-changing for the pharma industry.
Regina.
I just, coming back to your very first question, I was just thinking about a professor from Sloan, from MIT, whose name is Solo. who introduced the solo paradox, where the innovation in technology actually decreases the profits rather than increasing them. And, there was a lot of controversy about the paradox itself, but what, people do agree that there are many different factors that contribute to kind of slow down in technology. So I just want to kind of identify 3 areas related to, in my opinion, we need to address before we are moving forward. So the first, everybody agree, the technology in some area is nowhere to be found close to what it needs to be. Like, just to give you one example, we all are using for protein folding, AlphaFold, the ESM fold, these algorithms. Today, they're so slow that if you want to run any immunology application and run it on millions of TCRs, you cannot do it. It's like 1 year compute. So there are very basic computational questions that we still don't know, how to solve. But this we all agree, technology is not perfect, need to develop more. But I want to talk about other areas which we didn't discuss so far. One is regulatory landscape, and the third one is the economics of it. And I want to just mention a paper that was written by my colleague at Stanford, Professor of James Zhu, which was really an eye-opener for me. Because, we all are talking about like AI and healthcare and back and forth, but, whenever each one of us goes to the clinic, we actually never see any AI in healthcare. And, this was my feeling, but there was no proof. Is it like unique experience in Massachusetts, or it's something that goes on around the country? So, Professor Zhu have the same question, and what he did, he and his team collected 16 billion CPTs, this, billing records from all the American insurers. As you know, now this information has to be public. So they collected the billing codes from 2018 to 2023. And the question that he asked, how many of AI tools that are FDA approved actually we are billing for? So he identified that there were 500 FDA approved AI tools. Only 16 of them had billing codes. From these 16, only 4 has more than 10,000 billings. Only 4. And the one which was the highest number of billings had like 67,000. It was some tool for cardiology. So what these numbers tell us, including 2023, is that, AI didn't go to healthcare. It's not there yet. I think that pharma is actually much more advanced, but it's nowhere to be found in American healthcare system. But another interesting thing that he noted in his paper, that even if you're looking to these tools that are semi-adapted, tiny bit adapted, which have more than 10,000 billings, if you look at the reimbursement today, the American doctor who uses this tool is actually losing money on using the tool based on how the reimbursement is structured. So we don't have the right economical model to bring the AI tools into healthcare so that practitioners are reimbursed. And we really need to rethink about it. Now, if we are going back to the regulatory issue, this is also a very concerning issue because, as those of you who follow it and closely follow it, FDA consistently changing regulation of clinical AI, and also, another growing area, how AI can be used, in the clinical trials, how it can be used during process development, during the approval. A lot of confusion, and they try to do their best, but the rate of their advancement and the rate of technology advancement is currently not congruent. And it's not only true about FDA, it's true about EMA, about around the world. So unless we straighten up the regulatory aspect and make this technology both safe, but at the same time don't artificially kind of stall it, we are going to have a very slow adoption, and we need to be aware of it.
Can I say a few things? By the way, I really appreciate those comments, Regina. I came to Microsoft when our graduate school era at Stanford startup that was doing pathology, Bayesian pathology systems, was acquired after we generalized to jet engines and copy machines and so on. But we spent years fielding pathology systems that would help pathologists in the community do as well as teaching center hospital pathologists that work in one of the 40 tissue areas. And we showed how these systems worked at the expert level, but no one was interested in them. And we went to the ASCP conferences. We showed this. People said, fold their arms at our booth with young graduate students, MD, PhD. Like, this is incredible. We thought this was spontaneous combustion is going to change the world. And people would walk by and they go, I kind of like the slide deck you show. And the system was doing complete, hypothetical deductive reasoning with Bayesian networks. We were so excited. And we just thought, what would it take? Why isn't this exploding on the scene? And it gets into all sorts of nuances of why we can't transfer these technologies quickly when they would be valuable given status quo workflows and so on. Now, with that comment, I've waited at the edge of my seat as we've worked on applications and as AI has evolved for 3 or 4 decades since that moment where we said, well, we'll be acquired and we'll just, put Bayesian networks into Windows and so on. I think we're going to see changes now. For example, with Epic's strategic relationship with Microsoft, there is a hunger and desire to sort of now bring these technologies where they count into every or many hospital systems and to figure out how to make it work in a way that should be, hopefully, more magical than the IntelliPath system in 1989. So, in terms of perception and use and just ease of use and availability. So I think that, what is that famous curve that innovation, early excitement doesn't really happen? Which company? What's that? The hype cycle. I think we'll be surprised. And I'm going to come back to Regina in 7 years and we're going to reflect on where things went.
I think the other thing which will make a huge difference is, of course, talent, right? We didn't talk about that yet. We've been looking a little bit into the availability of talent, AI-relevant talent in the life science industry. And a couple of interesting things came out. Number one, it is clear that since ChatGPT announcements, right, 3x, the number of AI job postings in life science companies has gone 3x, right? What's fascinating is if you look at how does that vary by companies, some have gone times 1.3, and some have gone some times 6, right? So there's a real dichotomy emerging in the industry of who's really investing in in-house talent around that. The second thing, which is more challenging, is, okay, these jobs are out there. Today, there's 30 times more people who call themselves AI capable in life science companies than 5 years ago. I cannot imagine that actually there's 30 times more people who truly have acquired these capabilities, right? Third problem is, if you look at the top 40 companies where tech talent wants to go, there is not a single life science company in that top 40 list. Right, so there's just not that availability. And then lastly, if you look at who actually is in these life science company, in the AI talent, only 30% of those folks have data engineering, data science backgrounds, right? Which is, of course, the wrong ratio. That should be 70, 80%. And the leaders of all these teams, where do they come from? From other life science companies, from other pharma. So we're somehow anticipating that actually those folks who have been in the industry for such a long time and have not necessarily yet been able to crack the benefits and scale these technologies are now going to figure it out next. So we have a huge talent question, I think, as an industry.
I sort of say with Eric on this, it's like my worldview is what has propelled forward breakthroughs in how we operate. Agricultural revolution, printing press, cloud, mobile. It didn't start with social media. It didn't start with our people in Congress thinking, how do we regulate social media? It started with breakthroughs in social media, breakthrough with mobile. I think the same thing's going to happen here, whether we like it or not. When there's such a breakthrough technology, there wasn't a small Congress of all of us saying we have to switch to mobile. It was such a breakthrough technology that we all just adopted it. There wasn't some small Congress sitting together thinking we should switch to cloud. It was cheaper, better, quicker. We're all rational enough to say we should go and do this. Talent's an issue, but when I think about Pfizer, Merck, Novartis, Lilly, Janssen, how many have mobile engineers? Not that many. How many use mobile devices in their workflow every day? Quite a lot. Probably everybody that works at those companies. I think companies like Microsoft and others are going to build such foundational models like GPT-4, which is so intuitive. I have a 3-year-old who probably knows how to use it. I know how to use it. And so I think it's going to be more similar to mobile, and then everyone's going to rush to follow. We're going to see regulators, all the stuff Regina mentioned, regulators are going to have to rush and try and keep up with how fast technology is moving. Compliance, everything's going to rush to follow it. But I think it's going to be so similar to how we all, everyone in this room probably experienced the mobile revolution. We're all using BlackBerries. 5 years later, no one's using a BlackBerry. And so I think it's going to be similar to that. 5 years from now, I don't see a world where we're all not using, just like we use Google, ChatGPT will be the same equivalent.
But let's go Regina and Eric. They both seem ready to chomp on this. Regina, go ahead.
Yeah. So I agree and disagree with the previous speaker. I do agree that a lot of technologies that right now require some very special engineering or whatever would be streamlined with Microsoft and the like, and anybody can use it the same way as we use our cell phones. But at the same time, what excites me in this area is that we are really rethinking biology and biochemistry, in a sense that, if you look at the utilization of statistic and machine learning, like even 2 years ago, it was really primitive. It was just used as one tool among many to analyze the data. Right now, we're just at the beginning of the road of really rethinking what is possible, how you can, with machine learning from the very beginning, characterize the systems, how you can characterize immune system, fully modeling the representation of different players in the immune system and their interaction in one coherent way. So in order to, I don't think that, unless maybe Eric is going to say that Microsoft now has this magic tool, but I think there are so many areas where we don't even know how to think about them, combining deep expertise in biology and deep expertise in machine learning. So to me, a lot of things like, maybe the tools for organizing clinical trials and other things totally can be streamlined. But I think that the winner in this game will be somebody who not only can utilize the standard tools, this will be like the minimum, but totally think differently of how we are modeling what is a disease, what does it mean intervention, how do we model personalization and all these kind of things. So I firmly believe that when we are looking forward, there will be more and more kind of people who are both skilled in machine learning and in chemistry and biology, who would be sort of leading research in this area.
So let me clarify, Regina, because I agree with 100% with what you're saying. So I'm not sure we're debating about magical things for Microsoft versus what needs to be done, what can be done, what's the frontier in the biosciences. Completely agree, and I'm so excited about the prospect someday that we will understand the rich pathways and targets in a way that lets us, and the ability to design small molecules and large molecules to actually do interventions and, hit cancer in 2 ways at once to keep these cancers from evolving around pharmaceuticals and so on, in a personalized way. We're at the frontiers now, but I want to separate out when I said magical things. I meant when we have use cases like we can summarize a patient-physician dialogue in a way that can be reviewed by the physician and can save them, hours of time per day to spend more time with their patients. Or when it comes to writing authorization letters to insurance companies, which can be a pain in the neck for physicians and clinicians, and they can review and say, this is a great draft. That's the kind of magic we're talking about. Microsoft Word style, we can make this happen for, in every single electronic health record. That doesn't mean that I'm not personally, much more interested in this Wild West world right now of possibility of where things might go in the core science and the frontier there. It makes my heart skip a beat when I think about that, and that's not going to be easy to use tools. Even today, if anybody's played with Code Interpreter, you just get this, if you're a GPT-4 like subscriber, just drop down in the window, and I guess now it's called advanced data analysis, but the multi-step analysis, you can get a sense for even a scientific assistant or advisory tool someday. I pulled in a paper from like 1990 that I wrote with lots of math in it, and I could tell the system, look at these equations. I want to extend this in a certain way, and the system will read the PDF and read the equations that come back with extensions, and we can have a dialogue, scientifically. We recently did a study. I was working with Saul Perlmutter on PCAST about how this kind of interesting sequential tool that keeps on read in big data sets and analyze them and graph and visualize, how it can be used to help physicists out. And working with a set of physicists at the top of their game, we heard back, I'm not going to give the example right now, but like, I hadn't ever thought of that. Let's now go investigate that. This polymathic ability to make new kinds of connections and to augment even how our leading scientists in an area are thinking to spark new thoughts. This is where we're going to see game-changing advances in use cases for humanity. And here's what I'll say. I'll just summarize my comment here. 500 years from now, I'm not sure if Regina, and my other guests here panelists will agree. 500 years from now, I think the next 50 years will be recognizable and it'll have a name. And there's a lot of change happening, and there'll be incredible tools coming out for the sciences, and most of the big leaps for medicine and bioscience will be in the area that Regina just talked about. Not necessarily, summarizing charts and saving time. Yeah, I mean, fabulous, economically valuable. Let's get the magic thing running, but let's think now about where things are moving. Let's look at Regina carefully, what she's doing with her students. Let's look at what the rough edges she's seeing, what she wants from these tools. Let's talk about some of the game-changing examples in science. And also, let's not fool ourselves when it comes to really not being careful enough to look at what looks like magic when it's not really ready for prime time yet when it comes to the inferences. Because I think if anybody that really looks at these tools carefully, I think will have a sense that we're seeing what I call, maybe I named a paper erroneously with this word, we're seeing sparks of a new form of complementary intelligence that can really help us do new things in new fundamental ways.
So Eric, you mentioned AI world is kind of the Wild West. And, the Wild West was a dangerous place. And examples from health in AI are typically brought up to show AI for good. We see the tech titans marching toward DC every few months to speak about the challenges and the worries and dangers and possible regulation. What in the healthcare space should we be worried about? And how do we ensure we have responsible AI in healthcare? And this, I've invoked you because you said Wild West, but I open for all panelists.
These systems, as they intersect with humanity and complex worlds like healthcare, have numerous unexpected and inadvertent influences on people and society. For example, to this day, if you put, draw me a picture of a patient and a nurse and a picture of a patient and a physician, I think if we can try it out right now in real time probably, into DALL-E 2, you'll see that these systems are quite sexist. They still are relying on, the data that's drawn from parts of our society that we're not proud of, that we're still evolving on, long-term disparities and stereotypes. We have challenges with persuasive and believable, back to my comment about the sciences too, hallucinations or confabulations, where we were just talking before the panel, like thinking about when given these systems propensity these days, the current technologies, to imagine plausible things. A great use case is like think out of the box about things we haven't thought about yet and pull things together in new ways as the prompt versus go into the literature and tell me what's happening, what you've learned about a particular treatment strategy for a disease process. So it can be challenging for clinicians to see persuasive information that makes a lot of sense because it's kind of like that's the way it generates plausibility. That's wrong. And so I think that the idea of building systems as a long-term challenge that's calibrated to understand its own confidence more generally will be very useful. How do we regulate that? I think we're going to have to, the FDA and other agencies that regulate in other areas are going to have to rely on expertise and feedback from the community to figure this out, because I think that they're open and interested in, for example, when it comes to like a clinical use case where the system can fail at times, going beyond simply a product disclaiming that that's a problem with it. They're going to want more, I think, over time to weigh in on what are appropriate use cases where you have certain kinds of failures. So at Microsoft, when we ship a product with a foundation model in it these days, whether it be Teams or Word, Power BI, we have a deployment safety board that does red teaming with metrics. And the product will not ship unless the deployment safety board thinks it's up to par. And if it's not in certain areas or there's certain rough edges, we think through the cost benefit and how to disclose that performance problem or how to design around it somehow to protect the end user. the question is, how good are our deployment safety boards, and do they have to become external? Do they have to be audited in the future by a third party? Do we need government regulation? Right now, we're kind of doing self-regulation because we're ahead of the game in some ways, shipping before this regulation in certain places where there might be someday. And we've been weighing in and trying to inform regulatory agencies with what might make sense, balancing this idea of the innovation and the risk, societally as well as for the individual end user.
Ariel, want to jump?
Yeah. So if we're all using an AI, I would really worry about two things. One is it going to give me the wrong answer? And can I know if it's the wrong answer? And how confident is the model in the answer? And Eric was telling me before the panel, Microsoft has some good stuff coming out about that. So it could help know if it's giving you the wrong or right answer and how likely is it right. And then the second thing is, what's the data that's feeding it? So if you're running a clinical trial and you ask the question, help me find sites that have African American or Hispanic patients that could be enrolled that fit my inclusion criteria, does the actual AI that you're using know the answer to that, or is it going to make it up? What's the data that's feeding it? And so those are the two biases the biggest biases that I think we would all experience. I don't think it's regulators that are going to help solve those two. I do think it's going to be everyone in this room using it, getting answers, experiencing the answers. If you go to ChatGPT and ask that question, it'll say to go to clinicaltrials.gov. It's not the most helpful answer. And so there's going to be the application layer, which is going to be using the right data sources, reducing hallucination, using some of the foundational models that's going to help solve it. I come from the application side. On the foundational side, so think like Bard and Google and what ChatGPT is doing and all the other big players, I do think regulators are going to come into play on the foundational model side around what information is being used from the application side. So how is an application layer, how is Johnson & Johnson's data being used to train a foundational model, how are artists, musicians' information being used? So I think there's going to be regulation on the foundational side, and on the application layer side, stuff that you guys will interact with more. It's going top of mind is going to be what's data behind it, and how much does it hallucinate, and how do you toggle on that? So I think those are the two biggest areas.
Lieven and then Regina.
Yeah, I share the same concerns. I think regulation is going to have to play an important role. However, what I would be worried about is the awareness and sophistication of the end user of those risks. Because you think about in a pharma context, right? You have first, second, third line of defense for compliance, right? And there's a lot of training that goes on. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of learning how you actually make sure that first line of defense, which is the individual making a decision or engaging with a patient or a physician, is actually able to do that in the right compliant framework, right? What is the equivalent for the use of these technologies, right? How do you ensure that somebody's going to work with the amazing technology Ariel has, is actually able to sort of engage and understand and design the right question, design the right engagement to avoid an unintended bias in what is actually the clinical trial population by using these tools, right? And so that is going to be a really heavy lift because, but unless we get that first line of defense right, as we've seen in compliance, that's only when the first line of defense we got that right that we actually really got there.
Regina.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so much in disagreement, but that will be brief. Okay. So if you look at FDA or EMA regulation of AI, there is a flawed assumption there. And the flawed assumption is that if you're going to write, what was your patient sample on which you trained and what you tested, then the expert human, whoever it is, can come in and tell you if this, clinical AI system to be used. And as a machine learning person, I can say nobody can do it. Nobody can guarantee to you, even if we look at all the data and all the hospitals and they had women, men, African American, white, whatever, there is no way to know what it will do in a new hospital. And in my opinion, what we need to do is not to have a human who makes this decision, because now they don't have enough information. Just giving them basic statistics doesn't help. It's all distributional decision. We need to create a meta layer of tools that can tell us what are the distributional guarantees. When I'm going to give you now a new population, what are the guarantees that it's going to actually work on it? Or when I'm looking at individual patient and the model tells me this is 80% that this patient has condition X, how do I know that this 80% is actually a calibrated probability? We don't have a good tool to do it. And any consumer device that you are using has capacity to say, do not use me, something is wrong. Our models today that we are using for clinical AI or we are using in pharma don't have this capacity. capacity. So I think that the key way to ensure that these tools are safe, I would not say to remove the human expert in the loop, but to weaponize the human expert with an appropriate meta tools that can assess the dangers in the particular utilization and provide this prediction. And I'm sure that this is the closing of this meeting. I just want to say one sentence, Jim, if you allow me. There are 2 events for those who are interested that are upcoming at MIT. In December, we're organizing an event by invitation only with FDA to discuss, and with a representative from pharma industry and many others, to discuss, what the next regulation should look like and what are the issues with current regulations. If you're interested, just email me. And in a month, there is a big machine learning and molecular design conference coming at MIT. So if you want to see diffusion, flow model, or whatever else, we are there to show. So thank you.
Yeah, let me just mention a couple of things. Thanks, Regina, for your comments. Even I've been involved in several projects to distribute, sort of early versions actually into hospitals of supervised machine learning to predict, for example, readmission in 30 days, or to predict which patients, this is my work with Jenna Weens, would become infected with C. difficile in 48 hours, and a number of other, this is all traditional machine learning. And those systems, if you built them at Hospital A, this is the old-fashioned technology, which I think Regina would trust more distributionally, but move that system to Hospital B down the street in the same hospital system, this is MedStar, it wouldn't work very well. You need to really think deeply about the actual population that you're immersed in to understand and test and train and test, even locally, to understand these distributions, to have these guarantees that Regina is looking for. Now, in the generative world, we were speaking earlier about what your team is doing. There's the idea of thinking deeply about the use case. For example, this idea of building your own local database, retrieval augmented inference, and having the large-scale language models start chatting and talking about inferences that come from your own database that you've curated at your own hospital center. And there's a whole different world there as to how to constrain the kinds of applications so that you can do more trust. And let me just say that, again, Regina jumped to clinical care and clinical decision making, and there's a lot more that goes on beyond places where you need distributional guarantees. We should be thinking broadly about the spectrum of applications in healthcare and characterize the capabilities and potential errors and flaws potentially in areas where that's more acceptable, some failures that could be tracked by humans and human experts.
Yeah, that's spot on. So I wonder how many people in the room know a RAG-based approach versus an embedding and vector-based approach. So what you could do with ChatGPT is you could just take it and say, I'm just going to point it to this specific data set. And if you do that, you're going to significantly reduce hallucinations and only get answers that are in that data set. And so that's what I was referring to before. And I think most corporations will do that with all of their internal data. So instead of needing to search in SharePoint or Google Drive, it's going to be possible. It's going to be used in the clinical trial setting. It's going to be used in commercialization settings for sure of therapies. And so with that approach, I think the issues that I were mentioning, which is what is the data set that's powering it, and is there any hallucination or not, are going to be the really 2 blockers. And I think those are going to be solved over the next 12 months. And you're going to see widespread adoption in those use cases.
I think Regina's expression just now is great.
Lieven, do you want to get the last comment?
No, and I think it's super exciting, and I do think these technologies are on path to make a huge difference. I hope the 12-month timeline does hold. I do think that is then when the hard work for others in this room will start, which is how do you now truly implement that into your companies and your environment, and how do you truly change these primary research activities and flows, and how do you make sure that people are ready to do that, right? And that is the next challenge, I think, for us as a community.
Well, that brings us to the close for this session. Let's thank the panelists for a really great discussion. And thanks for coming, everyone.